If you read through the Old Testament and then read the Gospels, you might notice numerous parallels. For example, Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 is very similar to an account in 2 Kings, when Elijah multiplied loaves of bread for 100 men. Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness echoes Elijah's 40 days in the wilderness. In fact, you can find dozens of verses throughout the Gospels that match or echo passages we find in the Old Testament. Jesus' mysticists and some biblical skeptics use this data to argue that most of what the Gospels record is mythology, that the early church ransacked the Old Testament and rewrote select passages to craft a mythical account of Jesus. On the surface, their argument might sound convincing, but once we dig deeper, we will find their arguments are absolutely useless to help their case in claiming the Gospels are mythical. In the book, The Historical Jesus 5 Views, the scholar Robert Price presents the view that Jesus was a mythical character and not an historical person. Given that each author has limited space to present their position, they do their best to include the very best evidence that supports their view. Price uses over 7 pages of his chapter to present numerous parallels between the Gospels and Old Testament passages, thus indicating he believes the Old Testament parallels support his claim the Gospels are mythical reconstructions that were put together by later authors, plagiarizing the Old Testament. But one important point that Price and proponents of this view overlook is that parallels are often found throughout history. Let me begin with a story from my own life. For almost 3 years, I lived in southern Illinois and had a job that I didn't really like. In fact, some of the employees at the company openly told me they felt trapped and were treated like slaves, which honestly wasn't far from the truth. However, southern Illinois had an interesting nickname. It is called Little Egypt. I lived by Lake of Egypt, there was a gas station down the road called King Tut's, and a town called Cairo. One day, I finally built up the nerve to quit and decided to move to Tucson, which is in the desert. So I left a job that felt like slavery, which was in a place called Little Egypt, and went to live in the desert. Obviously, the way I told this story mimics the story of the Exodus. But does that mean I made it all up? No, this is actually a true story. But it was very easy for me to find parallels in my life to match an account from history. I also intentionally left out differences so that I could focus on what matched the account of the Exodus. In fact, given how many events and stories have been written down over the millennia of human history, I am sure if I spent a little more time, I could find another 2 or 3 dozen parallels in my life to historical events. Yet this would not mean the account of my life was a myth crafted from various historical accounts. It is a natural tendency for humans to seek out and highlight patterns. In fact, studies have demonstrated that human memory works far better when the random data can be shaped into interactive stories. So historians naturally tend to find patterns when researching, or they look for ways to connect events and historical figures. For example, early biographers painted George Washington as the American Moses. Abraham Lincoln has also been compared to Moses because both freed slaves. And writers today have highlighted parallels between Lincoln and Obama, even though there are numerous differences between them. John F. Kennedy has often been paralleled to the myth of Camelot, even though there are very few similarities there. Modern authors over-exaggerate a connection to make the story of Kennedy more interesting. So people can often manufacture parallels, even with very little to go on. So the mere existence of parallels doesn't mean an account is mythical. It could equally be as likely that a writer, when documenting an event, found something that matched that event from the past and wanted to highlight the similarities. Humans tend to enjoy finding and reading about repeated patterns in history, even though they can sometimes be a stretch. In the ancient world, this practice was magnified. Ancient authors often wrote in a way that mirrored events of the past. Jan Bremmer and Nicholas Horsfall note that Virgil borrowed from Roman legends to parallel current events of his day. Mark Beck writes, "It appears evident that structurally, Lucian modeled his life of Demonax on Xenophon's Agesilaus." He notes this could mean Lucian's work was fictitious, but he ultimately concludes it's more likely Lucian merely chose Xenophon's Agesilaus as a work he wished to mimic when writing his own account of Demonax. The death of Seneca the Younger was written in a way to parallel the death of Socrates. But that doesn't mean the death of Seneca was necessarily fiction. In fact, Rhiannon Ash notes Seneca may have committed suicide in this way on purpose to mirror Socrates. Ash also notes Tacitus wrote in a way to echo already existing structures and accounts. The later historian Socrates of Constantinople wrote about Hypatia and Origen in a way to mirror each other by highlighting similarities and ignoring the differences. Koen the Temmerman says, "There is the general principle that in non-fictional narrative, there is a prior series of events on which the construction of the narrative is based. Such construction involves not just possible manipulation of the chronological order of the events through, for example, flashbacks and flash-forwards, but also the imposition of causal and other connections between various episodes, interpretation and coloring of events and characters." So ancient authors often wrote about the current events of their time in a way to follow the construction of older events. In fact, the ancient author Plutarch openly admits that writers would seize on similarities and highlight them in his works. It is perhaps not to be wondered at, since fortune is ever changing her course and time is infinite, that the same incidents should occur many times, spontaneously. For if the multitude of elements is unlimited, fortune has in the abundance of her material an ample provider of coincidences. And if, on the other hand, there is a limited number of elements from which events are interwoven, the same things must happen many times, being brought to pass by the same agencies. Now there are some who delight to collect from reading and hearsay such accidental happenings as to look like works of calculation and forethought. They note, for example, that there were two celebrated persons called Attis, one a Syrian and the other an Arcadian, and that both were killed by a wild boar, and that there were two Actaeons, one of whom was torn in pieces by his dogs and the other by his lovers, that there were two Scipios, by one of whom the Carthaginians were conquered in an earlier war, and by the other in a later war were destroyed root and branch. I will therefore make this addition to their collection: the most warlike of generals, and those who achieved most by a mixture of craft and ability, have been one-eyed men, Philip, Antagonus, Hannibal, and the subject of this life, Sertorius. In other words, history often repeated itself, and when it did, the ancient writers were quick to highlight this and make the connections. So as Craig Keener says, the writer noting the parallels need only select, not fabricate the event. So since ancient biographers and historians wrote about their current events in a way to parallel past events, we should expect the gospel authors to employ the same technique if they were also writing biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. In other words, if the gospel authors were attempting to write history within their cultural context, we should expect them to look at past events within the Hebrew scriptures and find parallels to draw on. And scholars who do not think the Gospels are mythical have noted the existence of these parallels without issue. Albert Lord says, "Traditional narrators tend to tell what happened in terms of already existing patterns of story. When I say that an incident in the Gospel narrative of Jesus' life fits in a mythic pattern, there is no implication at all that this incident never happened. There is rather an implication that traditional narrators chose to remember and relate this incident because an incident of similar essence occurred in other traditional stories known to them and their predecessors. That its essence was consonant with an element in traditional mythic, i.e. sacred pattern, adds a dimension of spiritual weight to the incident, but does not deny the historicity of the incident." Bruce Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh say, "To be able to quote the tradition from memory, to apply it in creative and appropriate ways, not only brings honor to the speaker, but lends authority to his words as well. For example, the Song of Zechariah, the Benedictus, in Luke 168-79, is stitched together from phrases in Psalms 41, 111, 132, 105, 106, and Micah 7. The ability to create such a mosaic implied extensive, detailed knowledge of the tradition and brought great honor to the speaker, able to pull it off. N.T. Wright notes Matthew wrote in a way to parallel Jesus to Moses. Luke wrote in a way to make him look like another King David. None of this points to the conclusion that the Gospels are unreliable. In fact, Martin Hangel notes of Luke that his account always remains within the limit of what was considered reliable by the standards of antiquity. One could also argue that Jesus intentionally did certain things to echo events within the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus wanted to demonstrate he was the Messiah and the fulfillment of the Scriptures. So performing certain actions that mimicked or echoed the past work of God and highlighted prophecies would be expected of the Messiah. I mean, do mysticists think that for Jesus to be a real historical person, he could not attempt to repeat anything a great prophet did in the past that would demonstrate the power of God? And of course, we see other people wishing to mimic the past. Rhiannon Ash points out assassins found inspiration in the historical accounts of past assassinations. Generals and rulers often tried to model themselves after previous rulers. Roman emperors often tried to model themselves in a way to mimic the gods to prove they were of divine origin. So why wouldn't we expect Jesus to intentionally perform certain actions to demonstrate to Israel that he was the fulfillment of the Scriptures? And why wouldn't we expect the early church to highlight these parallels as much as possible to support their case? So just because the Gospel authors look for parallels in the Old Testament to the events that happened during Jesus' ministry, that does not at all support the notion the Gospels are mythical. In fact, based on what they drew on and selected, this probably could be used to support the notion the Gospels are historical accounts. Let's return to Robert Price's work, where he spent over 7 pages on examples of the Gospels writing about Jesus in a way to parallel or allude to passages in the Old Testament. According to Price, when constructing the myth of Jesus whole cloth, the authors of Mark made up the baptism of Jesus by taking bits from Psalm 2:7, then jumped over to Isaiah 42:1, then to Genesis 22:12. His 40 days in the wilderness recall Moses and Elijah's periods in the wilderness, but he cites texts from Deuteronomy to resist the devil. Then to make up the incident of Jesus calling his first disciples, he went over to 1 Kings 19, and moving forward in Mark to the incident at Capernaum, he went backwards to 1 Kings 17. Then Mark 1:29-31 is allegedly shuffled from elements of both Elijah and Elisha. But then, for the beginning of Mark 2, the authors jump to 2 Kings 1. And then for the beginning of Mark 3, they jump backwards again to 1 Kings 13. Then for the next part of Mark 3, the authors decided randomly to jump to Exodus 18. The calming of the storm in Mark 4 allegedly was plagiarized from Jonah, but also random parts of Psalm 107. The demonic episode allegedly also comes from Psalm 107, and apparently the Odyssey of all things. The raising of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the blood issue in Mark 5 allegedly were constructed in a more complex way by adapting the events of 2 Kings 4. But then the opening of Mark 6 allegedly comes from 1 Samuel 10. I'm not even halfway through Mark, and it should be obvious there's no clear pattern here. If we're going to construct a myth from already existing texts, there ought to be some formula or pattern you follow. Yet according to Price, the author of Mark constructed Jesus out of a random selection of Old Testament passages. They didn't follow one character or timeline, but must have randomly picked selections without any rhyme or reason. This is not a likely way to construct a work of fiction. You would likely follow an already existing formula or the flow of a text with only bits of randomness sprinkled in. For example, scholars note the Gospel of Thomas was likely constructed by following the structure and sequence of Tatian's Diatessaron. We can see a pattern in the flow of both. We see no pattern or discernible sequence in Price's hypothesis. And some of the passages can only be connected by claiming it's a complex reworking, which seems like a stretch, meaning many of these alleged parallels might not even be real or intentional. However, a more likely explanation is the Gospel authors were following a clear sequence. namely the real life and ministry of Jesus, and they simply scoured the Old Testament to find connections when it fit with things Jesus said or did. In other words, it makes more sense, and is a simpler explanation, to suggest the actual events of Jesus' ministry, gave the authors the outline to follow, and then they added literary devices and Old Testament parallels to make the story more interesting. This is more plausible than saying the whole account of Jesus was crafted by randomly jumping around in the Old Testament without any rhyme or reason. So ironically, when mythicists and skeptics who think most of what the Gospels record is mythical point out there are Old Testament parallels in the Gospels, they actually might provide support the life of Jesus is historical, because the parallels the Gospel authors drew on do not follow a clear pattern and are randomly sampled. So it makes more sense to suggest they just found parallels in the Old Testament when they wanted to make a connection to something Jesus said or did. And at the end of the day, we must remember humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and thus, we should expect parallels to exist, without it threatening the reliability of the Gospels.